Welcome, everyone. I'm Catherine Casey Nanda from the Acumen America team. And along with the Acumen Academy team, we're thrilled to have you with us for our first in our series on our leadership series on tackling poverty and racism in America. We're especially excited today to have you meet Eric Whitaker and Miriam Rivera. This moment of crisis in America has highlighted so many of the reasons that we started Acumen America 5 years ago. Over the past couple of months, we've seen the extent to which systemic racial injustice continue to shape so many of our systems in this country. COVID-19 disproportionately impacted low-income communities of color, and George Floyd's murder and just yesterday, Jacob Blake's shooting remind us of the daily violence and discrimination that people of color face in the United States. At Acumen America, we believe that some of the leadership that we will need to emerge from this crisis and rebuild our systems to be more equitable and inclusive will come from great entrepreneurs like Eric and Ashley and Irma and Abby, who you'll hear from in the coming weeks. And we invest in companies like Zing Health with the belief not only that they will impact the customers that they serve, but that they'll also fundamentally transform the broader systems that they operate within. Eric has spent his life tackling issues of health equity from almost every possible angle. He trained as a physician. We were just talking about his time in San Francisco General Hospital, and went on to found Project Brotherhood, a Black men's clinic that integrates social supports and healthcare. He went on to lead the state of Illinois' Department of Public Health and the University of Chicago Medical Center's Urban Health Initiative. And he's since founded several successful healthcare companies, including building an insurance business that he sold to United Health Group in 2016. Last year, he founded Zing Health, where Acumen America is an investor. And I think the thing that has struck us most about Eric during this crisis has been his tenacity, continuing to serve those seniors most vulnerable to COVID-19, while also successfully raising an equity round to fuel Zing's growth and impact in the coming years. Eric will be in conversation with Miriam Rivera, who is a founding investment committee member at Acumen America, and who is a pioneer in so many ways. She's a self-described inner-city, Spanish-speaking, low-income, free lunch, first in her family to go to college girl, who went on to 4 degrees at Stanford and joining Google as the second attorney during a period of explosive growth from 10 million to 85 billion from 85 million to $10 billion in revenues in a 5-year period. Miriam is now the co-founder and managing director of Ulu Ventures, a data-driven seed stage firm where she's built one of the most diverse portfolios in Silicon Valley. And I think the thing that has struck us most about Miriam is just how tirelessly she works to build diversity in both the investing and entrepreneurial communities. Before I hand to Miriam, just want to acknowledge the partners that make Acumen America's work possible. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, MetLife Foundation, Barclays, Autodesk Foundation, Dalio Foundation, QBE Foundation, Capital One, and Johnson & Johnson. We wouldn't be here without their support, both in terms of their capital and their strategic input. So I'm going to hand to Miriam now, and I will be back in 45 minutes with questions from all of you. So please do send those through the chat. Thanks.
So Eric, I think Catherine has given a little bit of a summary of your career, but I'm curious to understand what drives you personally moving from a physician working in academia to social entrepreneurship and now to venture-backed and private equity-backed entrepreneurship. What's made that story what it is?
Well, I think it all goes back to actually a Robert Wood Johnson founded program. When I attended when I was a junior in high school called the Chicago Area Health and Medical Careers Program. And this program was designed to find talented minority students, talented students in the sciences and expose them to the health professions. And at that program, which I would have been a junior in high school, and like 1982 or so. We did a visit to a maternal child health center for the Robert Wood Taylor homes, which at that time, they don't exist anymore, but at that time, they were the largest housing development in the world. And we go to the center, and there's this myth that, low income, poor people don't want health care. And I saw pregnant women lined up outside the doors of that clinic. And it was this little center, and it stuck with me. And in fact, I've written about that scene that's been indelibly etched into my mind in every essay I've ever written for college, medical school, public health school. I applied to law school, business school. I wrote about that scene, and it encapsulated for me, the health inequities that exist in the world, particularly for folks of color, and that scene has driven, most everything I've done up to this point.
And so how would you say that your focus on trying to serve these communities that are underserved has moved you from academia and ultimately to the private sector and to the kind of scale that's possible with private equity?
Well, it's funny. As Catherine mentioned at the outset, I trained at San Francisco General Hospital, and people who know me from that time in my life would be very, very surprised I'm in for-profit business right now. I've only worked in government and not-for-profits up until the point I really got radicalized and decided that, through philanthropy and through government, that the sort of ideas my wife and I, who I consider my wife as my partner and things that I do, that it wouldn't allow us to scale and have the impact that we wanted. And so, we had always been entrepreneurial in government and not-for-profits. And the question was, could we take our ideas that we were able to do in those settings and actually put it in to the test in the marketplace of capitalism, and so we believe that answer is yes. And then the second part of that is the belief that business inherently is not evil. It really is about the values of those people who run businesses, and could we take our values and import those into a for-profit setting? And so with the businesses that I've started, my wife has started, we have we believe successfully showed that you can do both of those things.
And what have been your greatest challenges in trying to do that? Are there challenges trying to serve this community? Are there challenges in terms of access to capital or other kinds of challenges as an African American entrepreneur that you would share with our audience?
Well, access to capital is always a challenge, and I would say that I'm an outlier, and that probably Zing Health, as the folks at Acumen who I work with regularly know, we could have easily gone out of business like 3 or 4 times during the time I was talking to them about investing. But I was fortunate enough I could liquidate my retirement and invest. And without that capability, this company wouldn't exist. And to give you a sense of, we sit here, we started last January offering insurance to seniors in diverse communities. We have 50 employees, probably 38 of them are African American, 7 or 8 are Latinx, unheard of in the insurance business. And we're going to hire another 20 plus people by the end of the year. And so the having the access to capital to first be able to get launched, and then having our personal ability to put money into our business, which, by the way, I was advised not to do. I was told by some of my investors, like in fact, one of my investors said, Eric, you can shut down and we'll back you on your next company. And I said, I'm a Black man. This is my shot. And if I shut down, I may not get another chance. And so we have to make this work like right now, or I may not get another chance. And so I'm just fortunate to be able to have my own personal resource that I was able to bring to the table. That if this had happened before I sold my first company that Catherine talked about, I wouldn't have had those resources.
Thank you for sharing that. I think there's a lot that we've been learning at Ulu Ventures. We've been in business for about 12 years now. And this summer, we actually undertook a research project on kind of the state of investing in underrepresented minorities around the country. And we learned that there have been about 1,000 venture firms that had made one investment in underrepresented minority founders. But if you looked at who had done the most investing, it turned out that there's only 50 firms in the entire nation that have done 5 or more investments in underrepresented minority founders in the last 5 years.
Wow.
And when you looked at the number of investments annually, there were fewer than 100 investments in venture capital in African American and Latinx-led firms in the nation. So access to capital is a tremendous issue, I think, for people of color. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to both expand our networks in particular directions of people who were also investing in diverse founders, and come to find that there's Ulu is in the top 10 in the country in terms of just numbers, as well as the quality of our companies in terms of getting follow-on financing. Because I think one of the things that you have been talking to is it's not just the first investment that you need as an entrepreneur. You actually are going to need to have multiple rounds of financing and access to capital to continue to grow your company over time. And that's something that I think is often harder for underrepresented minority founders.
No, I think without a doubt, we received an equity commitment of $150 million. And at the time that we closed the deal, we had $300 in our bank account with a $100,000 payroll due the next week. And I literally would have to raise money from payroll to payroll because we signed definitive documents and we had to wait for regulatory approval, which took about a couple months. And every couple of weeks, I would have to go raise money to be able to meet payroll. So it was, we literally could have gone out of business. And COVID happened in the midst of that, that process of waiting for regulatory approval. And I'm convinced that if we had not signed a definitive agreement, we would not have gotten that $150 million equity investment, and we likely would have gone out of business. I feel pretty confident just knowing how the private equity firm re-underwrote our deal again once COVID hit. So it was harrowing.
Could you talk a bit about that? How COVID-19 has affected your company as well as the communities you serve? That would be a good start. I'm going to ask you a follow-up question on raising capital in a pandemic.
Yeah, not unlike other companies, we went remote. And at that time, I think we probably had about 35 employees. We actually made the decision we're going to stay remote until next July. We've already made the decision to take uncertainty out of the equation, and we're setting up people at home with a desk, computer. We're assessing their online access and the speed at their homes. And so the biggest thing in terms of our team, we have a call center. We already have the technical backbone to be able to do that all remotely. And so now we're just planning to be remote. In terms of our members, actually in our employees, we actually had 2 of the 35 who were believed to have COVID. They never came back to the office. We actually had disbanded to go remote when we found out that they may have had COVID. In terms of we have about 350 insurees right now, and we've been fortunate. Only one has died of COVID, and that person was in the hospital intubated, quite sick. And we had another 31, I believe it was, individuals who had got diagnosed but didn't have to go to the ICU, and they were discharged home. And so, our population of members are largely African American, Latinx, and low income. So the communities in which we operate have a lot of COVID. In fact, where I'm sitting right now on the south side of Chicago, probably a couple of weeks ago was the number one hotspot for COVID out of 77 community areas in the city of Chicago. So we've been fortunate. It seems like a lot of our seniors took very seriously staying in the home, and we actually sent out COVID packets that had a thermometer, pulse oximeter, to be able to have members check their oxygenation, and also tips about how to use virtual medical services. And we also had our call centers calling to make sure people were okay.
Wow. And I will say that your statistics are much better than the city of Chicago and much better than our communities, the Latinx communities and African American communities. And I'm actually from Chicago, and my sister lives on the south side, and a brother lives on the west side. And I know that it's just been a really ravaging sector of the city. So great to hear that you're having such an impact. And this is kind of interesting because initially there was so much misinformation for communities, and that misinformation, there's some chaos that just happens normally when you enter a crisis situation. There's a scarcity of PPE. But I remember talking with my sister and just, basically saying, how could she make makeshift PPE out of just stuff that she had in her home? And that was going to be really important because I didn't think people were watching out for low income people and being cognizant enough of the difference between somebody who has to go to work every day or they don't eat because they don't get paid, versus somebody who can work remotely and, whether or not they have a mask or whether or not they have PPE is not life-threatening to them. But so I'm glad to hear that you actually did some very different things. Like I know my healthcare system didn't do any of that here in California, even though we were kind of early in the epicenter of COVID.
Well, Catherine mentioned at the outset, I was the state health commissioner of Illinois for 4 years, and I was in charge of planning for the state for pandemic flu preparedness. So our company was very aggressive very early on and calling our members and giving advice about staying in. We took it very, very seriously. Here on African American radio, there was this notion that Black people couldn't get COVID-19, and my wife and I called up and said, "Hey, that's crazy, and you take this seriously." So we were lucky, but we were also very aggressive at the earliest stages of when it got announced, just because I'm scared. I know too much about pandemics, so I was scared for everybody, scared enough for everybody.
Do you think that the diversity of your leadership and your team had an impact in terms of how you responded to COVID, and whether you were able to be more effective?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, if you look at literature, for healthcare, concordance between a physician and his or her patient makes a difference in terms of following recommendations. And I think that if we were to do a study of our call center, for example, I think that I believe, and we need to assess this quantitatively and qualitatively at some point, I think they can talk to our members in a different way and in an impactful way. I think that translates into how we sell our product. That our members, if you look at the penetrance in the African American community for our product Medicare Advantage, it's 19% in the country, whereas for the rest of the population is upwards of 40%. And we believe a lot of that delta has to do with education and who's explaining it and how it gets done. So that's what we hope as we continue to move forward will be part of our secret sauce, really targeting communities, speaking to them in a way that they understand, being cognizant of the various barriers to access to care. As one of our salespeople talks about, she talks about the fact that it's not enough to have a benefit. It's about making the benefit usable and accessible for an individual. So we spend a lot of time thinking through, okay, we can have a benefit, but if no one accesses it, why have it? So how do we make it accessible so that folks can actually use that benefit that they have?
That's a good segue, because one of the things that I talk about a lot with diverse founders is networks and how you have to actually make them actionable. So you're talking about usable, accessible, right? Mm-hmm. So as a founder of color, how did you use your networks and or access networks that maybe you weren't familiar with before, mm-hmm. in order to access capital, particularly during COVID, which has got to be one of the harder times to raise capital, just because uncertainty is not a friend to fundraising.
Yeah, I again, somewhere early on in my life, I got the message that networks mattered, and it's something that I pay a whole lot of attention to. And the other thing is, I'm not afraid to pick up a phone and call anybody in the world. I just am not afraid. I will do the research to figure out who knows who, and I don't know if this Miriam is just that I'm getting old, that I've come to know a lot of people, that if I get a person away from someone, typically I can get to the person I need to talk to. But one of the things, I have a 19-year-old and 16-year-old, I talk about networks with them because so much of success, in my belief, is the networks and being able to use them. And it has to be a mutual thing. You can't be in a network and always take. So I spend a lot of time, helping other folks and believe in karma, that it'll come back around in some crazy way. But certainly when you're in a hunt for money and the coffers are low, and you're calling people with the desperation that your life depends on it, because it does. I've been to that sort of place, and the thing is, one of the things I believe that investors will bet on folks who will find a way anyway to get things done, and I've been fortunate that that the sort of calls I've made have been answered, because we wouldn't exist without people who decide to place a bet on us.
Yeah, and I would just emphasize some of the things that you're talking about as so critical for fundraising, and that we try to emphasize with our entrepreneurs as well. One of which is research. Basically, fundraising is a research project, and you are trying to sell a product, which is your company. And so it's just like sourcing potential customers for a business in many ways. And, part of the job of the entrepreneur is to determine which funders fund the type of thing that he does or she does. Who do I know that knows these people? How do I get to know the people that I need to know in order to access that potential funder or customer, as the case might be, because frankly, customers are the best source of funding a business can have. It's called non-dilutive financing and cash flow, right? So we always emphasize that these skills are exactly the same in many ways, and that fearlessness that you talk about in terms of picking up a phone. I remember being coached when I was an undergrad. I came out to Stanford sight unseen, never been out west, came on a full scholarship. I got a job at the career planning and placement office because I saw that they help people find jobs after college. And I figured I'm borrowing some money, so I better figure out how I'm going to pay it back. And the people who worked there took me under their wing, and they basically made me go through all of the career sessions on interviewing, writing your resume. But the one that I remember the most being helpful in my career has been cold calling. There was a information interview workshop, and they would basically tell you, you got to research somebody, then you got to figure out, like, why would they want to meet with you? What's in it for them? That mutuality that you talk about. And then, doing the actual follow through and writing. In my day, it was writing a letter because you wanted to write an introduction letter, and then you called the main number at the company where the person worked and asked for that person by name. So you sounded like I'm writing him back about a letter that I sent him, so it sounded like you had some connection with that person. And I basically have used that approach at almost every point in my career in terms of developing networks where I didn't have them before. Including at Google. I remember reaching out to the general counsels of eBay, Yahoo, variety of technology companies, even McDonald's, because they were all companies that were bigger than I was, and I needed to learn different things about how they ran their legal function, how they were staffed, how they got into international operations as we were growing internationally. So I've used it always as a way to contact people, and we're still training our entrepreneurs in exactly this way of contacting potential funders and of being really relevant to them.
What I would say too, Miriam, it even goes beyond sales. Like I was talking with some brokers who will be selling Zing Health, for the 2021 year, and they told me we needed a specific hospital in our network, a health system. And I looked on the board of the hospital system, saw that there was someone who was there from the Methodist Church. He was this guy was born in Chicago, so I called a friend here in Chicago who was a Methodist. Said, "Do you know this guy?" They called someone else. I talked to that person. I ended up talking to that board member, and he set me up with the CEO of the hospital. This was last week. I mean, so there are 2 points I would make. One, this sort of skill goes beyond just fundraising, but to building your customer base. But secondly, there's been, I think, a negativity that's been associated with sales. And the thing I try to impress on all of our team is that we're all in sales. And so I would be like, how many of you all in sales? And if my hand is only one, I said, we're all in sales. Either you're selling your ideas, you're selling a product, we all are in sales. So we need to all get to love selling. That's my second point on that.
And one thing I would say, like, Google did this pretty interesting thing when I was there, and it was an early company, which was, there used to be a ticker machine that would rattle off the revenue per second that we were generating.
Wow.
And that ticker machine would stop if the website went down. And everybody would know in the entire company, we're not making money right now. And everybody would, do what they could to help support the engineering team to get up, to address customers whose business might be disrupted. And that kind of relevance of how a company is all about generating revenue and how everybody's job is essentially figuring out how do we generate revenue? Because revenue is the lifeblood of a company, right?
That's
and
right.
Without it, you're going to die. And even if you can raise capital, but you don't actually make revenue in the long term, you won't be a successful business. And so those two things are, go hand in hand. So appreciate that, example for other entrepreneurs to follow in terms of how much work is involved in developing your networks and building those networks, however it is that you get there, to access the opportunities that your company needs to grow. So that's been wonderful to hear about. One of the questions that I have about the current environment and the health, the safety of African Americans in particular, and Black skinned people. I'm sorry, I'm going to say, when they kill Black people, they don't bother to take a census to determine if that Black person is Afro-Latino or African American. And there's a lot of both that are killed. And I think sometimes this notion of health equity, we're thinking about it just in terms of health care, but health equity is also whether you get to live and be safe in our country. So I'm curious, how do you think that people in our audience who care about these kinds of issues can get involved in health equity, and what are some of the kinds of opportunities that you see there for especially young people who are building their career paths?
Well, I would, certainly I don't have all the answers on this, but one of the things I believe firmly is that you need to first start at home, and by that I mean in your companies, how you go about hiring, the vendors that you do business with, and the second thing I would say is you have to be really intentional about this sort of issue, because it's easy for us to fall back into the comfortable places from which we typically arise, and when you do this kind of work, you have to extend yourself and some places that are uncomfortable sometimes, I think that if you're not intentional about this, you don't really change what's happening in a given company internally, nor do you have the impact on the community that you could have. I'm a believer in health is more than just healthcare. And in fact, when we talked about me helping lead the urban health initiative at the University of Chicago, and I did not believe that we needed to build more clinics, more hospitals on the south side of Chicago, which is what our focus was. But in fact, we needed to work on economic development, transportation, making sure education for the kids in the communities was high quality. In fact, there was a companion effort the University of Chicago had called the Urban Education Initiative. There was a companion to the Urban Health Initiative that was focused on that very thing. But there's a whole nexus of other sort of things that are important to making sure communities are healthy and vital. And we have to pay attention to that. Now here, I told you where I live on the south side. We actually have been we've been a food desert for 6 years. Up until December 2019, we have a grocery store that's about 2 blocks from my house. But in the recent uprising, that grocery store was looted and shut down. So now we have another food desert until we can get that replaced. And what that means for people in this community, you have to travel a fair distance to go get basic things like food. But I think that companies, you can do good, like in the context of your company, just by paying attention to things like I'm speaking about in terms of your how you employ people and the vendors that you use and the impact you have in the community.
That's a very good point. This last week, ULU had an impact experience on race that incorporated our entrepreneurs, limited partners who are investors in our venture fund, some thought leaders, other folks in the industry that are other VCs, et cetera. And the big focus was how do startups actually impact wealth creation in the country, and how can startup founders be much more conscious of their role in the food chain of wealth creation. And I don't know if you're familiar with this statistic, but Acumen Capital, which is an African American led fund of funds that is an investor in ULU Ventures, did research with the Spark Center at Stanford University that showed that of the $69 trillion in assets under management, only 1.3% of them is invested with firms that are led by people of color or women.
Could you repeat that stat again?
So out of $69 trillion in assets under management in the world, 1.3% is invested in firms like Acumen or like ULU that are led by women or people of color. Yeah. And so, and entrepreneurs are, you know, they're taking capital from different investors, but I don't think most of them are aware that this is the state of the world. And when you think about this, of that $69 trillion, $38 trillion is capital that's coming from employee pension programs. And a lot of that is government employees. You know, it's the teachers, it's the federal employee system, it's, you know, pensions like Los Angeles Fire and Police pension, for example, or Chicago Police pension. And it turns out, you know, as much as people may have issues with any particular kind of body like this, they're more diverse than average, right? Like the teachers of Chicago are more diverse than other asset managers are. And when you think about it, all these people's pension is going 98% to white male-led companies.
Yeah, but I think that's our challenge, Miriam, is, and that's another thing that drives me is, you know, somehow people, you know, these investors believe that if they invest in folks of color, that it's somehow charity, you know, that you know, they don't have the expectation that ULU can go out and make money or Zing Health can go out and make money. And you know, part of what drives me is to be a venture-backed company, which, you know, I've heard figures as low as 1% of venture capital has flown, you know, gone towards Black founded companies. That you know, I want us to be a unicorn that's venture and private equity backed. That and so that those investors will have an exemplar of a company that does great work, but also makes them a lot of money. And so, you know, so to the extent that you're successful at backing companies and you know, and bringing home, you know, the returns, and I build companies of scale, maybe, just maybe we'll be able to change the perception of investments and your venture firm and ones like it, and you know, people of color who are founders of companies.
And I actually think that that's a big part of my job as an investor, is to educate the limited partner community who, you know, have the bigger pools of capital, right? The pension funds and the fund of funds, because what a lot of people are missing is that, in fact, in venture capital, the facts are completely contrary to that. The Kauffman Fellows Research Center did a study recently on 20 years of venture-backed investments, and what they determined was that ethnically diverse startup companies outperformed all white companies by 30%. And that startup companies that had ethnically diverse senior management outperformed all white companies by 60%. So in fact, it's not charity, it's actually doing better by your investors if you're investing in diverse teams, because they're financially outperforming. The same is true for women-led companies, but I think the stereotypes get in people's way because they make assumptions that are biased, and there hasn't been the data to say that's not the reality, that's the bias speaking.
Yeah.
And fortunately, there are new ways of actually doing some of this research. The Kauffman Fellows Research Center used AI-driven approaches to actually, go scan everybody's LinkedIn, see if they were people of color, did they have things that were indicative of being in a different culture, et cetera, so that they could create the pool of information around diversity in the industry, because it just didn't exist before. And so we're seeing that a lot of the times people make these assumptions that are just wrong and aren't supported by the data. And, our hope is that once they actually understand that, that they will take advantage of the opportunity that we have, I think, uniquely in America, because we are one of the most diverse countries in the world. And we can take advantage of all that we have within our country in terms of the skills, the ethnic backgrounds, diverse educational backgrounds that make for a successful team.
Yeah, I mean, I think even worse, and I think this goes towards your bias comment, that I've heard some allocators of capital at pension funds say that they have to be a fiduciary for the capital, and that therefore they cannot look at diverse firms. I counter by saying, well, if you know the statistics, then in fact, if you don't look at diverse firms, you're not being a good fiduciary of the capital that you allocate. So we do have to have education, and we need the data that can support that firms like yours, or like I know Capeport Capital just did a recent study of their investments, and they also showed that they had top tier returns by backing women and minority founders. So the data, hopefully the data will continue to come in and support that there needs to be a broadening of those who get the capital.
Yeah, it's really astounding. When we looked at the numbers, even we were surprised at how low they were. But there's fewer than 100 investments made in underrepresented minorities by an industry that's making between 4,000 and 6,000 investments per year.
Yeah, so, I don't know if you saw, just recently SoftBank decided to set up a fund for minority founders, but of their $3 billion vision fund, I think they had invested in one woman-owned founder and maybe a couple of African Americans out of the $3 billion, and so they as people start looking at their portfolios, they'll see that they're not looking at the breadth of talent that there is out in the country.
As a matter of fact, SoftBank has launched a $100 million opportunity fund that's focused on underrepresented minority founders. And I know some of the folks, one of them is an African American woman I used to work with at Google, Stacy Philpott-Brown, who's the CEO of TaskRabbit, which recently sold to IKEA. And so I think that, people are trying to get on the bandwagon, which I think is a good thing. And we actually co-invested just recently with SoftBank on a deal that's led by an African American woman who was originally from Chicago and now living in Brooklyn. But it's a long ways coming, and it's really surprising that it feels like it's 2020, and we're still where we are. I'm curious about that in your experience recently too, around Black Lives Matter, and again, some of the activities around police, and some of the looting and other damage in communities of color that have happened from some of the protests, and how you think that is it just going to be business as usual in the U.S.? Do you have more hope from these protests than you've had in the past? I'm curious to hear your perspective.
Well, I've been joking that the country's going to have a conscience for another 15 minutes. so I must admit I haven't been the most optimistic about things. We have these points in history where we raise awareness, and it always is a question of what are we going to do now. And so, I want to give us a year to see if some of the proclamations that are coming from the corporate community, from a lot of quarters of the country, are going to be followed through on. I do worry that, the looting, which, there's a lot of pain out in communities, and the looting is getting conflated with, peaceful protesters. And I think that to the extent that you see a lot more of that, it'll shorten the 15 minutes to a lot, a less amount of time, as people are getting less sympathetic as looting continues. So hopefully, we can see the peaceful protesters went out and in the national conversation, and the looting not overtake it.
Yeah. And I would say that maybe I'm a bit more optimistic because I have young children. Well, they're younger, like in the sense that I have a college age child and I have a high school age child. And, one thing that's really changed is just the level of diversity in our youth is very different from what it was at one point. We are now a country where the majority of children are brown, and they are mixed children. And I think that they're having a different experience of being accepted and of expecting change than I think our older generations could. And anyway, that's my hope, because I grew up in the 1970s, and so it was after a period of significant social unrest and change, right? And I do feel like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the different legislation and cases around things like even interracial marriage, right? Like I'm in an interracial marriage. My husband is white from Iowa. You know him from Grinnell College. I'm Latina, Afro-Latina from Chicago. And, we couldn't have been married the year I was born. At least it would have been recognized in the country. And I feel like that there's just been so much hopefulness in the younger generation. And I do hope that business in particular steps up, because there's been a lot of commitments, and we'll see if they turn into action. But the level of action is more than I've seen probably in Silicon Valley in 25 years.
Yeah, I see we've been rejoined by Catherine, but
Hi, Catherine.
It's hard to cut this conversation off. Yeah. But Eric, go ahead.
No, yeah, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer. I believe a lot of progress has been made. I think that's undeniable. The question for me is whether or not the pace at of change that we need will occur, because we need massive change. And if anything has been demonstrated over history, people don't like to give up power. And, that's what we're watching. I believe we're witnessing in this country, that, we are about to become, the minority is about to become the emerging majority. And there's a lot of discomfort around that. And what does that mean? So I do think, to your point, Miriam, our kids are our best hope in this way. And I just think about, Barack Obama is a close friend of mine, and when he said he was going to run for president, and he said, we're going to go to Iowa, and I went to college in Iowa, and I said, these white folks in Iowa aren't going to vote for you. And that's what I told him. I said, you shouldn't run for presidency. And he didn't. He ignored me, and he ran, and he won. And then, fast forward, when he's into his second term, and I was talking to my daughter, and she says, is Uncle Barack going to run again? And I said, well, Uncle, he's limited to only 2 terms. And then she turns to me and says, well, do you want to be president? And I thought about that, because I couldn't even get my mind around the fact that Barack Obama could become president from where I sat and given my life experiences. And here my daughter is, that's all she's known. And she thinks it's a casual thing to ask, her dad, could he be president? So I do think that, we have to pin our hopes on our kids. And they are having a more diverse, in a lot of places, a more diverse experience than we've had in the past. So let's bet on the kids. So
yeah.
Thanks to both of you. Hard to jump in on this one. We could keep going here, and really appreciate your leadership and how you've shared both of your stories today. It's really, as I open with, we really believe it's leadership like both of yours that is going to lead us to a better future in this country. And that's really reflected in how Acumen America invests. It's thanks to Miriam's support, we're at 60% of our companies have a founder of color, and 40% are led by women, and that's something we want to continue to strengthen in our portfolio. We have a few questions from the audience. The first is whether you have any advice, and Eric, you started to talk about this, but if you have any advice on how to bring investors on board if they don't understand the market you're serving.
I had some challenges on that front, I have to say, it's hard. I mean, I literally had people say, why would you focus on diverse populations? And that's was central to my thesis of what I wanted to do. I think it's an education process, being able to have the data about why this market is an important one to tackle and why this is a timely time to tackle it. I think it became easier once I got some investors on board, and the investors who were first through the gate were ones who understood the social impact that we were trying to have. So it made it easier to make a sale once someone had already joined on. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I had hard conversations with people who were who basically were telling me my idea was stupid. so why would you do that? And I suspect that for a lot of the type of investments that Acumen has made, they would have a similar sort of dealing with some investors who are uninformed.
I would say as an investor too, that it really is fundamental to getting an investment that you concretize and quantify your market for an investor. And sometimes I'll tell you a couple of different stories about people who did this. One of them was a woman entrepreneur who was in the fashion industry, and she was just getting nowhere with, the predominant VC in Silicon Valley is, more than 80% white men. So they did not really understand fashion. So one thing she did was come in with all the fall editions of all of the major women's magazines. And if anybody's ever seen them, they're like the size of phone books, that fall edition, with all of the fashion and all the advertising that takes place in those magazines. And she basically threw this gigantic stack of phone book-like magazines in front of these VCs and said, you know, this is XYZ $1 billion worth of advertising for women's fashion. And then they're like, it concretized it in a way that they could really relate to. But I've also heard stories of people camouflaging that opportunity. So one of the companies that's in the barbershop software space, which now is a space, thanks to, in part, this company that is consumer focused in the sense of small businesses and their consumers that are getting haircuts. They were a couple of founders who wanted to get venture capital, and they positioned their whole company visually, graphically around white hipsters, white male hipsters, and beards and things like that. When the reality was that these guys were African American, they were really going to pursue the African American market, but they could quantify the market for barbershops, but the graphics were about white men because that was something they thought investors could relate to more effectively. And they did. And that company has now gone on and raised like over $30 million in a recent round. I hope that people don't really have to camouflage, but they did what worked.
Mm-hmm.
I think, unfortunately, we only have time for one last question. It's a related one to both of you, around how should early stage founders think about racial equity in the early days of company building? How should they promote racial equity on their teams and in their products?
Well, I want to answer that really quickly, just because there's been a lot of research recently around this topic. And one is, in those early stages is when the bulk of your equity will be granted to your co-founders and your early hires. So if you don't really hire women, and if you don't hire people of color, you have just made a decision that you will not allow most of the wealth in your company to be impacting those communities. In addition, if you haven't even thought about, are there people of color that could be investors in your company? Well, if your company is really a great opportunity, you're also saying people like me won't have an opportunity to invest in you. And that means that people who are trying to promote diversity in venture capital and entrepreneurship won't get access. And just think about it. Every time you're making a decision, what board members you're going to have on your board, you're also making a decision that you will be a less effective company. Because one thing that we know is that companies that are more diverse at the early stages are actually more financially successful. So you need to make sure that you have diversity in your boards, your investors, your employees, your suppliers, and that will help make you a much more successful company.
And I would just return to that word intentionality. To Miriam's point, of our first $3 million in our seed round, 1/3 of that was African American folks who invested. And that was by design, because one of the things I'm trying to do here is create wealth so that individuals like myself can invest in our own communities and not have to rely on philanthropy from others to be able to do that. So I'll just stand on Miriam's answer, but we actually made that intentional, that we would have a large part of our investor base be African American from the beginning.
And we've seen that work in Silicon Valley with Thai, which is an Asian community, Indian immigrants and Indian founders. They supported each other. And if you think about the access to capital that the Indian community has got now compared to 12, 15 years ago, it's astronomical. They're running Microsoft, they're running Google. it's because they intentionally invested in their own communities as well.
Well, thanks again to both of you. We are unfortunately at time, but thanks for kicking off this series for us. I can't imagine a better.
Did we lose Catherine?
Did you lose me? Huh?
Hey, Miriam, are you still there?
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're at 2:01, so I don't know if it cut out.
Did I get cut off?
I can hear you, Catherine.
Oh, you can? Okay. Maybe Eric just can't hear me. Sorry. Maybe our tech is telling us we've got to wrap, but thank you both for this conversation. We will be back on with our second.
So Miriam, you think we're done?
In the series, we've got some technical glitch. We'll be back on September 2nd at 11 a.m. You'll get an email reminder about that session, which will be with Bitwise Industries. But thank you both for this conversation, and sorry for the tech glitch at the end. We made it all the way with that one.
Take care, Eric. Take care.
Okay, we'll see you soon. Okay, thanks a bunch.
Bye.